All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to join our July webinar. My name is Jeff Yeagley with Compass IT Compliance. I'll be today's moderator for the webinar. A couple housekeeping rules before I introduce today's presenter and before we get the actual webinar started. A couple quick things. There's a chat box on the lower left-hand corner of your screen. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to pop them in there. You can address them to myself. Again, my name is Jeff, or to Todd Knapp, and we hopefully will have some time to answer any of those questions that might come up at the end. If everyone on the line could do me a huge favor and just mute your lines, that way we can minimize any type of background noise or distractions that might occur, so that we don't take away from the presentation for anyone else that might be on the line. So today's webinar is going to be talking about blockchain, and I'm sure you guys that are in the technology field, if you've read the news lately, you've seen blockchain in there, you've seen Bitcoin, you've seen Ethereum, and all these different cryptocurrencies. So today's webinar is going to be really, really interesting because I think these are some terms that often get confused and misused for lack of better terminology. The other awesome thing is that today we're going to have a guest presenter. So today we have Todd Knapp from Envision Technology Advisors. Envision's a partner of Compass. We work together on some projects, and Todd's the CEO of Envision. So a little background on Todd. He's been providing IT services really across the country for the past 20 years. Has quite an extensive background in enterprise network architecture and strategic planning. Back in 1998, he founded Envision Technology Advisors, which is really a technology and business consulting firm that has offices in Providence, Rhode Island, and the greater Boston area. In addition to all of the work that Todd does with Envision, he speaks really throughout New England on a number of technology topics, including emerging technologies, virtualization, Internet of Things, leveraging the data economy, and numerous other topics. In addition, he's a contributing editor to 3 different segments of Tech Target, so he's very, very well versed in all things really information technology. And I've been through this presentation. It's awesome, and I think you guys are going to enjoy it. So without further ado, I'm going to pipe it down, and I'm going to let Todd take over. So Todd, thanks for presenting, and take it away, man.
All right. Jeff, thank you so much. I appreciate the introduction, and everybody, welcome. I'm very excited to be talking to you guys all today. As Jeff said, we're going to talk about blockchain and really try and dive into it a little bit more and get more detailed about what it is and also what it isn't. Getting us kind of kicked off here. As was mentioned, I am the founder and CEO of Envision Technology Advisors. My contact information is up on the screen here. I'm going to click off this momentarily, but if anybody wants this information, wants to talk more about it, you can certainly get that information from Jeff. I also, as Jeff mentioned, I do speak all over New England and throughout the country on topics around technology. I travel a lot to conferences and spend a lot of time looking at innovation technologies. So I've got a Facebook feed, a Twitter, all that stuff that everybody's got these days. If you want to stay in touch with what I'm doing, this is where you can find me. So just one little note on my background. I am in the business of understanding emerging technologies and innovation. I am not a programmer. I am not a Bitcoin specialist by any stretch of the imagination. There's a deep depth of mathematics and complexity in what we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to do my best to try and convert that into the English language for you. But along the way, you may end up with some questions. If I can't answer them, I know the folks who can. So don't hesitate to ask me anything, however detailed it may be. If I'm not the guy, I will make sure that you get the answers that you need. So let's talk about blockchain. And kind of before, every time I have this discussion with people, I want people to understand the enormity of what blockchain is. And so I always ask everybody, hey, I consider blockchain to be a transformative technology. What do you think an example of a transformative technology might be? And I get lots of answers from people. Some people say the internet, which is not a bad answer. I've had people talk about cell phones, also not a bad answer. The example that I frequently use is I use GPS. I consider GPS to be a transformative technology, and the reason that I say that is what GPS really is it's a bunch of satellites around the Earth that do a very simple job. All they do is provide the current time and their own position to the client, and the client calculates a circle based on that signal delay. So the client knows what time it is, the satellite knows what time it is, whatever that difference is the signal transfer time, and based on that information, the local, your phone or whatever you're using, GPS receiver, can determine where you might be at any point on this circle that you see here. When you get a second satellite, you get overlap. And so that overlap shows you two places where the circles cross. We now know we're either here in the northern hemisphere or here in the southern hemisphere. That's actually enough information in most cases to be able to determine positioning. If I know I'm in the northern hemisphere, clearly I'm here. But a third fix gives you the exact answer. And so the reason that this is important is that transformative technologies produce ecosystems of other technologies that come along after the fact. So things like IP geolocation. Everybody remember those beautiful, ignorant days when we said, oh, we've got all these IP addresses. We're going to make this block of 76.150 is going to be for the Northeast, and 76 will be the Northeast, and 150 will be Boston. And so we're going to know where everybody is based on their IP address. That lasted about an hour and a half before we started shipping addresses all over the country and started using load balancers and other global technologies that negated the value of that. Then we got into cellular triangulation. That was pretty simple. That was, all right, our cell phone knows where it is based on knowing where the cell towers are. So the cell towers are fixed. They're not moving. So if we know their current latitude and longitude, then based on signal strength, we can kind of determine where we are, again, using that triangulation. Some of you may or may not know about Google's Wi-Fi positioning system, but that system is essentially, they actually kind of got in a little bit of trouble over this. What happened was, as Google was mapping and using Google Street View, and they were recording all those images, they ended up listening to the signal strength of every Wi-Fi network that they encountered along the way. So they've documented my home Wi-Fi network. I have 2 dogs. My Wi-Fi network is called the Dog House. So they know in some database somewhere in Google that there is a Wi-Fi network called the Dog House that at a specific GPS position gives us 35% signal strength. So actually, I'm sorry, I'm just noticing a little chat here about if you're having any trouble seeing the video, yes, the video has started, but if you're having any trouble seeing that, just try reconnecting to the session and it should pop right up. So anyway, the Google Wi-Fi positioning thing is now Google knows, just based on every Wi-Fi network it can hear, roughly where you are. So there's a reason I'm telling you this whole story. You might be asking, well, why does this matter? How does this relate to Bitcoin? The reason it matters is that foundational technologies like positioning, GPS, create a network of resources that agree on information, in this case, your location. This technology was started to solve for one very specific use case. The military wanted to know where they were, right? And then it very quietly in the background expanded, and now it's in all the consumer navigation products that you're using, Waze, Google Maps. You know, if you've used Google Maps or Siri or anybody in the last couple days to get where you're going, that's a function of that beginning foundational technology. Anyone who has ever been on a recreational boat at this point or a ferry, that's all being driven by GPS. The whole drone industry, which is an $11.2 billion industry just for commercial drones consumer drones in the U.S. Those drones are GPS powered. Trucking and logistics. Every time you get a package from Amazon.com and you get notice on when that thing is going to arrive. Uber and Lyft don't work without this. Your Chromecast doesn't work without this. Netflix determines what content they can deliver you based on where you physically are in the world. They're getting that information from GPS. And every single time you've ever typed pizza into the Google browser and it said, here are the 5 pizza joints closest to you, that location system was doing its thing. Amazon.com, all these things. So foundational technology, GPS and positioning, underpins trillions of dollars of industry and product, and it's become part of our daily lives. And it's almost invisible. You'd never think about it. That is the enormity of transformative technologies. That is the enormity of blockchain. So with that perspective, let's talk about defining blockchain. So blockchain is a distributed ledger that provides chronologically ordered, trusted data integrity without independent third-party involvement, either publicly or privately. So everybody's good. We're done. We can hang up now. No, I'm just kidding. Obviously, we're going to translate this whole thing into English. That's a lot of words. It does mean something very specific. So let's kind of break that down. What do we mean by a trusted network? So we've got a very simple situation in the world, right? We're just people. We're just a bunch of dudes running around. Somebody's got a house that they want to sell. Somebody's got cash that they want to buy the house with. The problem is that inherently we don't trust each other, right? We've all seen that movie, the one where the guy's like, I've got the hostage. Have you got the money? And the other guy says, yeah, I've got the money. Give me the hostage first. No, you give me the money first. We don't trust each other because we're pretty convinced that if we hand over the money, the guy's going to leave with the money and the hostage. So we've taken that mistrust into almost every transaction that we do in this world, and we've built elaborate systems to validate transactions as a function of that mistrust. In the case of a home sale, we hire a real estate agent, and the real estate agent pulls in a bank, and the bank pulls in an attorney, and everybody gets involved. All these independent parties get engaged to help you feel confident that when you hand over the money, that you are actually going to get the house in return. And so these people go through a process where they examine the transaction. And only when they feel like they've done all the due diligence, they've checked to make sure that the house has never been sold before, they've gone through and said, okay, is the house even still standing? Let's go do an inspection. And does this guy actually have the money, and is he creditworthy? After they've done all that, then they operate as the middleman. You give the bank the money gives it to the other person, that person transfers the deed, again through a title company, all happening with huge economies behind it of people and places and companies that are all there for no other reason than to create trust where none existed. So that's what I mean when I say a trusted network. That's what we're trying to overcome. So where did blockchain come from? Blockchain is actually the result of an October 2008 paper that was written by Satoshi Nakamoto. And the crazy thing about Satoshi Nakamoto is that to this day, we still have no idea who that is in the real world. Satoshi Nakamoto is a pen name, and it may be an individual, it may be a group of people. Nobody's 100% sure about that. But the October 2008 timeframe, there's nothing coincidental about that. What happened in September of 2008? If I had everyone on this call in the room, a couple of people might be shaking their head in recognition. September 2008 is when Lehman Brothers folded, and when the entire subprime mortgage lending issue nearly collapsed an industry in this country. And we spent several years, trying to recover from that. And so there was this issue of, the problem with our financial systems, according to Satoshi Nakamoto, and everybody's got their own opinions on this, but a lot of people felt like after that happened that there were a chain of events that weren't that dissimilar, and everybody said, boy, this is a really greed-driven system. And wouldn't it be great, the problem with all these validating companies that, like the mortgage lenders, is that, hey, the whole subprime mortgage lending scandal was a function of those trusted third-party verifiers not doing the verifications the way that they needed to be done. And so anytime there are humans involved in a system, that system is at risk. So Satoshi Nakamoto published a paper. It was titled Bitcoin, a Peer-to-Peer Electronic Cash System. And inside that paper was the framework for blockchain. Blockchain was the underpinning of Bitcoin. And so the thing I want you to understand first is that blockchain and Bitcoin are different technologies. And in so many ways, if you think about your accounting software like, Great Plains Dynamics. Great Plains Dynamics runs on Microsoft SQL Server. They are completely different technologies. SQL can be applied to many, many different things, and it is. It is the database, for lots of e-commerce sites and, for lots of pieces of software that have nothing to do with accounting. but it is what the accounting package runs on. That is the same relationship between blockchain and Bitcoin. Bitcoin is the platform, is the software, and blockchain is the platform upon which it runs. And it just so happens that blockchain was invented for Bitcoin, but it is now being applied to many other things. So let's talk about what a public ledger is. So a public ledger, first of all, before we show the little animation here, you guys have all been part of a public ledger at some point. When you were in college, you were in the dorm room and everybody said, hey man, you want to order a pizza? And everyone else went, yeah, let's order a pizza. And there was suddenly a conversation, a little flurry of discussion around, hey, can you spot me my $5 and I'll come back to you on Tuesday? And someone else was like, you already owe me $5. And that whole process starts. That's a public ledger. Everybody's hearing it. Everybody knows who owes whom what. And so if somebody later said, hey, you owe me $30, but everybody in the room heard him say earlier that it was there when the transaction took place and knows that person A only owes person B $10, then everybody in the room is going to go, well, that's not right, man. You're misremembering this, or you're trying to scam $20 out of our friend. But one way or the other, you're wrong. That's a public ledger. The only difference between that public ledger and this one is that this one is recorded in a database. So the public ledger is a peer-to-peer system of computers, every computer being able to talk to the one next to it. As transactions occur, everybody gets a copy of every transaction that ever occurs. So every system has a copy of the ledger since the beginning of time. So whether it's being used to track real estate transactions or Bitcoin or its Ethercoin or its medical records, every single transaction that has ever transpired exists and is publicly consumable information across every node. And I've got my little graphics, got a bunch of PCs here, but in most cases these are mobile devices, cell phones or tablets, even though they contain every transaction that's ever occurred, the blockchain itself is storing hash data, so it's actually very small amounts of information, and in aggregate it still doesn't add up to a giant volume, and we'll come back to that. But the premise of this public ledger is that once all the computers are talking to each other or devices are talking to each other, they all then say, okay, it's time for a new transaction. And so the first thing they all do is say, hey, does my ledger match your ledger? Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Oops, no, it doesn't. So we now have one node where we know that the ledger that device has is wrong, either because it failed to be updated somewhere along the line, or maybe because it was corrupted by accident as part of a bad byte on a disk somewhere, or maybe somebody is trying to defraud the system and they've manually changed the data. But whatever the reason is, we don't really care why. All we know is that it's not valid, and so we basically replace its copy of the ledger with one that we know is valid, and now it becomes a member of the network again, right? So this is how a public ledger works. So what is blockchain? How does blockchain work? So blockchain is a public ledger. We talked about that before. A block is data that gets run through an algorithm that takes into account the block number and a modifier called a nonce that produces a SHA-256 hash that is trusted, meaning that it begins with 4 zeros, okay? Now, I know that was a lot of techno speak right there, but SHA-256 hash has been around a long time. Anything can be converted to a reduced to a SHA-256 hash, and we're going to do a live demo of that in just a couple minutes. So we're going to bring this all home for you. But the key things to take in mind here is that when we have a block, the data that goes through that algorithm accounts for the block number. So I know that this is block number 1 or block number 2 or block number 3. And that's how we're going to chronologically order these blocks later. And the modifier, a nonce, and we'll just set that aside. I'm going to actually show that to you. And we get this 256 hash that begins with a number of zeros. That's why we know it's trusted. So a chain is the group of blocks that is chronologically ordered, where each block is signed, meaning that it's trusted, starts with zeros, and references the hash value of the previously signed block. I'm going to demonstrate this to you because it is very hard to conceive of just in your head. But the moral of the story is that if you change one block, you invalidate the entire chain, okay? So blockchains are distributed. Each node, public or private, has a full copy of the chain. We saw that earlier. And nodes have to agree on the validity of their chain in order for new transactions to occur, a public ledger. Invalid chains are not accepted and have to be replaced by valid copies of the chain, right? So I just threw a ton of information at you, and I'm sure that a couple of you are like, wow, I kind of get what you're saying and I kind of don't. So let's try and bring this home. There is a demo, and I wish I had written it, but as I mentioned, I am not a programmer, so it's one that I co-opted. A gentleman in Cambridge, Mass. actually wrote this demo, and I use it from time to time in this. Actually, that's the guy right there. And we're going to actually take a look at what a hash is and how blockchains work. So this is actually a hash. What you see underneath here, this whole string that starts with E3B, this whole thing, E3B0C44, blah, 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 ending in B855. This is a hash. A hash is a numeric representation of whatever piece of data you're looking at. And in this case, it's a blank data field. So the blank data field runs through a 256 hash algorithm, produces that hash. I can reduce anything I want to a hash. So if I type in my name, you'll notice that this no longer begins with an E, it's now F79B, and it ends in 81EC. It doesn't matter what I type in. The hash is representative of the sum total of these values being converted to binary and then being run through the hash, okay? So you could literally take the entire contents of Moby Dick and reduce one of the greatest works in literature and history down to a single 256 hash if you wanted to. So the reason this matters is that we know now that we can encode whatever data we would like to into a hash, whatever that would happen to be. If we wanted to turn that hash into a block, we want the hash to begin with 4 zeros, okay? Now we know that a blank block of data doesn't begin with 4 zeros. Well, in point of fact, if I type in my name, that's still not 4 zeros. Let's type in Compass IT Compliance. Let's see, and as much as we trust Compass, not a trusted block, doesn't begin with 4 zeros. Let's try my company's name. Nope, no good either. Well, as it turns out, it is actually very unusual to have a block that begins with 4 zeros. You specifically need to engineer that block to begin with 4 zeros. So I mentioned the nonce earlier. What a nonce is a nonce is a number that we plug in and add to the value of the data so that when it's run through the hash, it will calculate to 4 zeros. We get to that nonce by mining a block. So if I have a blank block of data and I mine it, I will get a nonce of 72608. If I put my name back into this block, you'll notice that I've turned red now because this is no longer trusted block. The block doesn't begin with 4 zeros. I can mine it and I get a different nonce, 21930. So when I convert the word Todd into numbers and I run it through the hash, it doesn't produce. When I run it through a SHA-256 hash, it doesn't produce a value that begins with 4 zeros. 5 zeros. If I take and add this value to this data, then I produce a trusted block. So we now know what a block looks like, and this is block number 1. If this were block number 2, it's a different nonce. So it's the combination of the data, the nonce, and the block number that makes a block trusted or not. Okay. So if I look at a blockchain, a chain is really very simple. A chain says, okay, block number 1 has this nonce, this set of data, and oh, by the way, we're going to add this previous value is now the next piece of data we're going to add to make a blockchain. And the previous data, all these zeros means this is the first block in the chain. When I get to block, the resulting hash ends in 97CF, right? So if I look at block number 2 is also currently valid. Its hash begins in zeros. And when I look at the previous value, it ends in 97CF. Yep, same thing as the hash before it. So the value in this is, let's go ahead and start creating some, let's create some values here. Todd has, let's say Todd has, oops, that's 10. Todd has 10 Bitcoin. Todd has a house. All right. So if this is the first ledger entry that we've got, and we mine this entry, we get a nonce of 133,032. And so we've now created a piece of information, and by mining it, running a calculation to get to this nonce, we have validated this transaction is now begins with 4 zeros. So we're going to call this a valid transaction. Now, if I then said here, Todd has 10 Bitcoin, Todd sells his house for 1,000 Bitcoin. And now let's mine that transaction. And I'm doing this kind of on the fly. I've actually never used this text before. It is possible for these nonces to get into gigantic numbers. The bigger the number, the longer it's going to take to mine. And then for number 3 here, we're going to say, well, Todd has 1,010 Bitcoin now. So let's assume for a moment, oh, there we go, and we'll mine this. Let's assume for a moment that these are the transactions that have actually occurred in a blockchain. Now, in this case, we're using this blockchain to record more than just coins. We're using it to record things like houses, right? So in this case, this blockchain says, I started out with 10 Bitcoins in a house, and when it was done, I had 1,010 Bitcoins and no house, okay? That's great. In a distributed ledger, there would be now thousands or millions of computers around the world that would all have this information. And in order for me to add a transaction to this, they would all need to first agree that the ledger is the ledger. So what happens? Well, if I suddenly decided I'm going to change this to say Todd has 2,010 Bitcoin before I add transaction number 4, as soon as I go to add this transaction, everybody else on the internet is going to say, you know what? You're lying. You didn't have 2,010 Bitcoin. You had 1,010 Bitcoin. And they're not going to care why it's a lie. They might think, well, you know, there's been some calculation error, or you've got a corrupted hard drive, or whatever it is. Maybe I'm trying to defraud the system. They don't know. They don't care. All they know is my transaction can't be added until my copy of the ledger is updated to a current and correct copy. Now, the other thing that is really important to understand about a blockchain is that blockchains depend on the notion that you have to do work to invalidate a blockchain, okay? So here's what I mean. This blockchain, its previous hash references this hash here. So if this hash changes, this hash is no longer valid. So if my current, and I apologize, I don't know if you guys can see my mouse or not, if it's broadcast, but if you've got a block in like block 2 here, and the hash of block 2 changes, then the previous value that's referenced in block 3 is no longer good. That's what I was trying to say. Therefore, if I went back to the beginning and I said, I don't have enough Bitcoin in my account, I want to defraud the system, I'm going to add a 0, I have now invalidated the entire chain. Because first of all, adding this 0 means that this nonce no longer works. So this block is invalid to begin with. Second, my hash changed everything above it, because the next block, part of its calculation, is that it references the previous hash. Well, guess what? The previous hash changed. So this is no longer valid, which means that number 3 is not valid. So now consider that, for example, the Bitcoin blockchain may have, you know, hundreds of millions of transactions occurring in it, okay? With hundreds of millions of transactions, changing a transaction that occurred 6 months ago invalidates every transaction after it. Now, on top of it, I can't mine just the last transaction to make it valid again. So if I mine this, and you know it can take a long time, you know, it's either going to fail, or if it doesn't, in this case, the only thing that becomes valid is that one block. Every other block before it is not trusted. So again, even if there were only one node in this blockchain, the only way for me to defraud it by changing a prior transaction is now to one by one mine every single block until I get to a healthy chain again. So why does that matter? It matters because the nature of blockchain is that in the history of blockchain, it has not yet been compromised. Okay? That's a big statement for an IT guy to make. Every time an IT guy says, this can't happen, it happens like an hour later. But I'm telling you right now that in the history of blockchain, blockchain has never been compromised. That doesn't mean that Bitcoin hasn't had problems, because with Bitcoin, they wrote software that uses blockchain as the underlying engine. Well, their software says every coin that we issue has a public key and a private key. And you may have heard a few years ago about a loss of about, I want to say it was like 2.5 million Bitcoins, and it translated, or excuse me, $2.5 million in Bitcoins. It translated into big dollars, and everybody went, Bitcoin's not safe. Well, what happened there was there are public and private keys for your Bitcoin, and the company that was storing the Bitcoins didn't secure the private keys. So you know what? Great. If you give me the keys to the house, I can walk through the front door. But the underlying blockchain never changed, and the underlying blockchain has never been compromised. Because if you're talking about hundreds of thousands of transactions, or even 100 transactions, the amount of time that it takes for me to modify this and then remine every single block to get to a valid chain, and then simultaneously compromise every single node that is connected to the blockchain and transfer all of that information to every single node without them noticing and before another single transaction occurs, makes it logistically virtually impossible. The blockchain is about having a trusted architecture that is independent of third parties. So back to that definition. Distributed ledger, we know what that is. Providing chronologically ordered trusted data integrity. Chronologically ordered. We're looking at the transactions in the order in which they happened. Trusted data integrity, we know that the blockchain cannot be defrauded because the time that it would take to actually do the calculations means that other transactions have happened that are now approved that have invalidated the block that you're currently trying to violate. Without independent third-party involvement, meaning I don't need the bank to validate that my transaction occurred. It's being validated. It's being they refer to it as notarized. It's being notarized on the blockchain as the transactions occur as a function of public consensus. Now, the last little bit there, publicly or privately, right? So Bitcoin is a public blockchain, meaning that everybody has a node, everybody has a copy of all the transactions that have occurred. You can actually have a concatenated copy, but everybody has a copy. There are companies now that are building applications on the blockchain that are where those blockchains will reside in 30, 40, 50 data centers around the globe that one company will control. So it is a private blockchain, but it is still notarized and a function of consensus and distributed. Those are the tenets of the blockchain. So before we jump into the blockchain economy here, I'm just gonna make a note and say, hey, if you are having questions on the things that I am saying here, because I've just thrown an immense amount of information at you in a pretty short space of time, please feel free to post the questions right back to the chat here, and I will do my best to respond to them as I see them. I got a nice response from somebody who is letting me know that you can, in fact, see my cursor. Thank you for that. With that said, let's continue into the blockchain economy. So this is actually a slide from last year that I co-opted from a public presentation that IBM did, but I thought it was really well done. So I grabbed a copy of it for everybody, with IBM's permission, by the way. Everybody talks about the blockchain, or people who are in the know about the blockchain often talk about it like it is replacing economic value in our country and in the world. And what I mean by that is, one of the applications of blockchain is to do things like programmatic contractual transfer of real estate. So in other words, if I have everybody's got a deed to their house, but actually in the real world, records for this stuff are actually stored electronically, of course. If I've got an electronic record, a digitally signed deed for a home, and I've got a cryptocurrency or even a national currency converted to cryptocurrency, it is actually possible for me to simply write a contract and load it into the blockchain, particularly with Ethercoin. And Ethercoin, by the way, if you've never heard that term, Ethereum, we mentioned Bitcoin earlier. There are over 900 cryptocurrencies in the world today. Bitcoin is the one that most people hear and know about the most, but Ethereum or Ethercoin is coming up a close second right now. I'm going to talk a little more about that in just a moment. But the Ethereum platform allows for programmatic currency. So we can together sign an electronic contract that says my house is going to undergo an inspection. When the home inspector uploads the value, if the value is equal to or greater than the value required for this transaction to occur, automatically retitle the house in the name of the buyer, automatically transfer the currency from the buyer to the seller. So once you sign into that electronic contract, it is now written to the blockchain, it is indelible, it is notarized on the public ledger, and now the moment that the home appraiser uploads the value, that transaction will occur without needing a bank, without needing a mortgage company, without needing all that third-party validation, all that stuff we paid closing costs for. And so people say, well, geez, isn't that doing damage to the economy? We're essentially removing entire segments of industry with the blockchain. Well, the reality of the blockchain is that this is a technology like any other. It doesn't happen by magic. There is a huge amount of work that goes into the creation of the blockchain. The blockchain economy begins with blockchain developers creating applications and solutions, whether it's Bitcoin or it's going to be some of the other companies I'm going to mention in a few minutes. They build the technology, and somebody has to pay them to do that. The blockchain network operator is the company that's actually running servers that are storing the blockchain or are running platform that allows for the blockchain to be stored publicly in people's independent devices. Then you've got access to existing logic. So we're not going to suddenly build a system specifically for storing titles for homes. That system already exists. We need to connect our network, our blockchain network, to an existing data set in order to be able to mine that information and make those programmatic currency exchanges happen. Then we've got security certificates that need to happen. You've got a business network that connects market participants. So in other words, once we've got whatever technology we're using, and a good example would be if you've heard news about Uber starting to accept tipping of their drivers through their app. That is an application of blockchain, right? So the business network has to connect those market participants. And then you've got everybody that's involved in the actual transactions, and whether or not that's consumer transaction or a B2B transaction. In the case of this slide, they were talking about B2B, but it could be either. You have people that are actually transacting, people that are mining bitcoins, people that are spending bitcoins, people that are tipping drivers or whatever other application you're using the blockchain for. Regulators. This is actually the regulatory industry is keenly aware of blockchain. And by the way, the regulatory industry generally loves blockchain because, again, you're talking about something that is instantly notarized as a function of public consensus on a publicly distributed ledger. That is really exciting if you're a regulator. It makes fraud incredibly difficult, if not impossible. And so that model is something that regulatory agencies are spending a lot of time on. And by the way, the federal government is too. I listened to a great conversation. I had a discussion with the CIO for the Federal Reserve. And the Federal Reserve's job is to maintain a record of every financial transaction that flows through a bank or a credit card. That's one of the things they do. They're very, very interested in the blockchain and in cryptocurrencies in general because cryptocurrencies are difficult to defraud. So there's an entire economy that is springing up around the blockchain. And so where it's used today, first of all, if you've ever heard of the dark web, and the very, very short version for those of you who haven't is there is an internet behind the internet. Right now you search through Google to find websites. Not everybody wants their web server to be visible to Google. Some of them are essentially, I wouldn't say hidden, they're just indexed in a different way, and you use a browser called Tor to access them. One of those is called Silk Road. Silk Road was a website where you could get online and buy drugs, buy guns, you could actually buy human beings on Silk Road. It's not a good thing. But it was shut down in 2013 after $1.2 billion in drug transactions happened in 1 year through Silk Road. It was only about 4 months before Silk Road 2.0 popped up in 2014. And then they were shut down again. They were raided towards the end of 2014. And by they were raided, what I mean is a series of hosting providers were raided. The servers were shut down. A handful of people were arrested. And another few months later, we had Silk Road 3. And I want to say that we're in like 3.6 right now. But Silk Road was an anonymous marketplace, and because the nature of Bitcoin is that it is a publicly ledgered, verifiable currency, but you don't need to use your real name to have it. It is possible to have currency that ensures anonymity. And so that became sort of the currency of choice for the dark web. And so everybody began to associate Bitcoin with bad things. But there are better uses for this, right? So Bitwage is a great example. We've been talking about cryptocurrencies. I mentioned Ethereum. Excuse me, I had a little sip of water there. Bitwage is a group of folks who said, man, wouldn't it be cool if we used Bitcoin to allow people to transfer money to their kids in college? And so they built Bitwage around that notion, and it wasn't called Bitwage at the time, but they basically opened up a public exchange so that you could use your US dollars to transfer Bitcoins or Ethereum or any other cryptocurrency that you wanted to another individual. And what they discovered all of a sudden was, hey, this is getting used a lot in South America and in India and in a couple of places that they weren't expecting. And when they looked into it, what they found was that one of the problems that programmers in Venezuela have is that when they work for U.S. companies get charged a pretty significant fee to wire transfer money out to their offshore programmers, and the offshore programmers lose as much as 35 to 40% of their earnings to bank and government fees associated with taking in, and also taxes that are associated with taking in currency from outside their own country. And on top of that, the transactions occur sometimes 10, 15, 20 days after the work has been performed. And on top of that, there's a fair number of those transactions where the U.S. company sends money to a foreign bank in South America, and they get confirmation from their bank that the currency was transferred. Then they get a phone call from their offshore programmer saying, hey, how come you didn't pay me? And when they look into it, they say, hey, we don't know what to tell you. Your bank got the money. You have to take it up with your own bank. And down there in South America and some of these small banks, the banks look the employee in the eye and say, I don't know what you're talking about. We never got the money. And these people don't get paid. So this is a really big problem for offshore programmers. Bitwage solved the problem. Bitwage said, you know what, we're going to allow U.S. companies to pay by using U.S. currency with Bitcoin, basically converting it to Bitcoin or Ethereum or any other cryptocurrency, and pay their employees overseas this way. It eliminates the wire transfer. It eliminates all those fees. It cuts the transaction time down to about 3 days, and it makes the accuracy of the transaction much more accountable because of the public ledger. And so the result of this is that the employees are getting more of their salary, and they're getting it faster. And on top of it, along the way, one of the things Bitwage discovered was, wow, sometimes we get paid U.S. currency that needs to be paid to employees, and when we do that, in the time it takes us to buy the Bitcoin, Ethereum's value dips briefly, and so if we switch the money into Ethereum and then wait for it to come back up again and pay out the difference, we can make money on the currency exchange. And Bitwage is doing a heck of a business now doing that. So the people are working cryptocurrency markets in the same way that U.S. banks work foreign currency markets, and they're making big money doing it. In fact, I read a great article about a young man who's not even out of high school, who's a millionaire right now, having never left his chair. All he's been doing is trading cryptocurrencies and watches cryptocurrency markets, and when they're down, he buys. When they're up, he sells, and he's been making good money doing it. Token is another company that tried to solve a problem, a banking-style problem, and their name is not coincidental. It turns out that if you are in the medical marijuana space, or in Colorado, the recreational marijuana space, it's surprisingly difficult to get a bank account. And the reason for that is that there's concern among federal regulators that illegal drug money may be getting laundered through institutions like this, and so the banks would much rather not have to deal with those audits, so they just they won't transact business with those kinds of companies. And even though they're perfectly legitimate, they're unable to get bank accounts. So Token set up a cryptocurrency-based bank account where these companies can convert their normal U.S. currency into cryptocurrency and maintain their accounts online, pay bills online, just like you have your check processing through Citizens Bank, where you go in and you pick out your electric bill and say, yep, pay that bill. You can do this with Token as well. There was a great article that I read from actually the founder of Token, and he was talking about the reasons why banks have a hard time having accounts for marijuana companies, all the stuff I just told you, and then right in the middle of it he said, at Token, all of our transactions are notarized on the blockchain, creating an immutable ledger of every transaction that has ever happened. As a result, the cost of the audits and reviews as they pertain to marijuana dispensaries are drastically reduced or even eliminated. So I thought it was very succinct. But the reason that I bring it up is that talking about industry changes, I have a very close relationship with a big CPA firm, and they do a lot of business every year doing audit. Well, you know what? If every transaction that occurred in a business was notarized on the blockchain, and everyone had an immutable ledger of every transaction that had ever occurred, guess what? We wouldn't need to do the audit. The audit is happening every minute of every day as every transaction occurs in real time. So when you think about compliance, when you think about things like SSAE 16 SOC 2 compliance, or the old SOX work that we used to do, and even HIPAA and Mass High Tech and all those things, PCI compliance, a lot of that process could be changed. That whole landscape is going to look radically different as a function of the blockchain, and it'll be different. It's not going to go away. It's just going to be different. So right now, there is over $1 billion in funding that has been put into blockchain startups, and that's actually of that $1 billion, more than 2/3 of it is in the last 18 months. The big accounting firms are spending big money right now to write modules, plug-in modules for accounting packages that blockchain enable the transactions in those accounting systems, and particularly. I know of one particular large accounting firm that has put over $25 million into development of a plugin for Great Plains, so that you can literally make every transaction you record in Great Plains become recorded on a distributed ledger in a private blockchain network. Why would you care about that? Well, in the last year here in Rhode Island, we had a nonprofit, a very large nonprofit, and it turned out that the controller had been defrauding its own nonprofit, and just by changing records in the accounting system. If every transaction that was entered as it was entered went onto a public blockchain, that could not have happened. It would have been impossible. The currency markets are starting to react to blockchain. Increasingly, conventional currency traders are turning to cryptocurrencies and are turning to blockchain as a ledger technology to record transactions. China is the very first nation to announce publicly that they are in the middle of a development effort to completely replace their national currency with a cryptocurrency, essentially shouldn't say replace, they're going to convert their currency to cryptocurrency because China has big problems with fraud and with counterfeiting, but that goes away if it's underpinned by blockchain. So other things that blockchain is being considered for. There's a really cool open source company called Follow My Vote. When I was 16, I remember being in an argument with my father about elections, and he was complaining about the number of people who vote, or rather who don't vote. And even back then, I said, well, it was a different world when I was 16. I think at the time I may have had a let's see, it would have been an IBM PS2 Model 30, I think. But I remember saying, if somebody could write software where we could install voting software on our own computers and then dial up and transmit our votes, that's saying dial up. That's sort of also dating the conversation. But even when I was 16, I said it would make a lot more sense if we could vote electronically. And I remember very clearly him, telling me that there's no way that would ever happen because there's no way you could ever ensure that it couldn't be defrauded. Imagine for a moment if every American had a copy of every American's vote. You wouldn't have to be personally identifiable. Maybe it's done by tokens. But if all voting occurred notarized on the public blockchain, and every voter who participated was a node in that blockchain, every single person who voted not only is voting, but is ensuring the accuracy of every vote that follows. Because now you've got millions of systems simultaneously agreeing that, yep, this vote was cast and this vote was cast in this way. Fraud would be gone, and it would be possible for us to take a huge population of people in this country who don't vote and make them voters. So it's a very powerful notion. Programmatic contracts and currency, we talked about. Health records. I told this story recently at a blockchain presentation, and I realize we're 9 minutes remaining, so we're getting to the end, I promise. But unfortunately, I have a family member who has a degenerative illness, and eventually it'll probably run its course, and that story will be told. But in the meantime, she almost died last year because she got ill and she went to a doctor out of town. And when she got there, the doctor called in for medical records, and one specialist hadn't put the medical record with the rest of the file. Some of her record made it to the hospital that she was admitted to, and they administered a medication that was contraindicated for her condition because they didn't have the whole story. Imagine a world where you have a token that you have where when you go and check into a hospital, they say, okay, we would like access to your medical history. Are you willing to provide that to us? And you said, yes, I am. And you took out your phone and accessed your medical history app and enabled a single-use token for a period of time, say 2 days that you're expecting to be in the hospital, and then gave that to the hospital. They input it in their system and instantly have access to every single transaction that has ever occurred, every prescription you filled, every doctor you visited, every single diagnosis ever made. It's an incredibly powerful notion. That's what the blockchain could do for us. And you could do things with the blockchain where you could, select categories that you wanted to make available. There's a million things that are possible. Self-driving cars you guys have all been hearing about. What you may not have heard about is that one of the things Google has done is they've developed a self-driving car that uses Bitcoin and blockchain technology. And what this car is capable of doing is when you get into it, it's essentially a taxi or an Uber for all intents and purposes. And one of the examples they used was making the car a member of Uber, where when you select an Uber vehicle, this driverless car pulls up. You get in. When you pay Uber, Uber pays the driverless car through Bitcoin. The car has its own bank account. The car is capable of detecting a fault. The car is capable of scheduling its own mechanic's appointment. The car knows when it's running low on fuel. The car can be an independent business with no human behind it. And for all intents and purposes, as long as it's willing to maintain itself, that car could run indefinitely. That taxi can run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, conducting its transactions autonomously, including its own maintenance, and it would run until the day that the parts are no longer available. And so, that's a very interesting notion. We talked about real estate titling. We haven't talked about decentralized cloud storage, but there's a whole industry popping up around taking bits of information and dividing them up, storing them in the blockchain, and having people that are able to essentially rent out available space on their servers and workstations to store encrypted data for folks out on the internet. And Storage.io and Factom are two companies that are doing that. So, by all means, look these companies up. It's a very, very powerful thing. So, wrapping up with 5 minutes to spare, I think. Blockchain, in my mind, is one of the most promising foundational technologies of this decade. I hope, if nothing else, you'll walk away from this understanding or having a sense of the enormity of this technology. I have heard lots of presenters begin their conversation by saying blockchain is as important to the world as the invention of the internet. And I don't start my presentation that way, because the first time I heard it, I went, yeah, right, whatever. I can't imagine anything being more important than the invention of the internet. But the reality is that, if I think about GPS, where I did start my presentation, and think, what would my world be like if GPS didn't exist right now? Wow. Be very, very different. I wouldn't be taking Uber. I wouldn't be doing all the things that we talked about earlier, and I certainly would not be as confident that I'm going to be taking a trip I'm doing some volunteer work for Reef Check, doing ocean surveys. I leave on Friday. I'm flying to a very, very tiny island very far south, and I'm incredibly glad that GPS is there, because barring that, they're going to be doing it with celestial navigation. So, for me, when I look at blockchain, I think about those technologies that happened that I wasn't even really cognizant of it as it was going on, but where trillion-dollar economies were formed as a result. That is what I see in blockchain. Its potential as an investment, as technology, is growing exponentially every single day. And as I tried to show you today, it's actually not all that complicated. At its most basic level, I'm going to store information in a block, I'm going to sign the block, I'm going to store them chronologically, and I'm going to reference the block before me. And by doing that and then distributing a copy of every transaction to every single person that participates, I can assure that it is virtually impossible to defraud. That's as simple as it is. So, questions. The chat is open. If you guys have a question, feel free to post it to the chat. Jeff, I don't know if you're seeing things that I'm not, but if I'm missing questions, feel free to moderate. Again, you guys are welcome to email me anytime you want. And I hope you got something out of today, because I certainly had a good time telling you about it.
Todd, thank you so much, man. That was really awesome, and I think it's such on the surface, it seems like something that's so complex, but you did a great job of breaking it down, so at least maybe I'm a little bit biased because this is the second time I've seen your presentation, so maybe I cheated a little bit, but I think it's just an awesome technology that has a great future, and you identified that throughout the course of your presentation. Folks, if you have any last-minute questions, again, feel free to pop those into the chat box down there. We will, or have been, I should say, recording this webinar. It'll be posted to the Compass website and YouTube channel later this afternoon. So if you want to go back and maybe go through it again, you can feel free to do so. If you want to share it with anybody, of course, that you think might be interested in this topic, of course, feel free to do that as well. I'll take a quick peek here. We have one person who said thank you, Todd. So Todd, again, great job. With that, I will close out this webinar. Again, thank you to everybody who took their time out of the day. Todd, thank you a ton for presenting on this. I know that this is a pretty wild topic, and it's gaining some steam and a lot of traction, and seems to frequently be in the news. So thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to present to our group today. Really appreciate it. And folks, enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Have a happy and safe weekend, and we look forward to presenting to you in the near future. Take care, everybody.